that symbol doesn't really bear much meaning for people in Islamic cultures as well as East Asian ones. So that's when they started adopting new symbols, new styles of representation to represent neutrality in different cultures. For example, I had a project where I went to Greece, right? And we thought it would be nice to use the symbol of the meandros, the little spiral thing, a very Greek design. However, from like learning through like interviews and whatnot, we learned that it's actually a symbol for an alt-right political group, depending on how it's used and what colors it's used on. So we had to be very mindful of stuff like that. And I think when you're designing for a specific group of people, it's very important to do your research. And if you can, talk to these people. That's probably the biggest takeaway from all this. Make sure you're doing your research as you're being respectful, but also accurate in terms of what it is you want to communicate. And so here's the brief little history lesson, just going over how we got from manuscripts all the way to the international style that we see here. So for example, manuscripts, very tedious process written on parchment, only written by monks for a select few that could read at the time. And so how we got to the invention of the printing press as well as the Industrial Revolution overall, things became a lot more mass produced, right? So we started seeing type become a lot more accessible to a lot more people. Things started becoming systematic and formulaic. But then we had the arts and crafts movement in about the 1860s through the 1930s, I think, where we kind of went back to a more romantic style of depiction with some more industrial quality of life improvements. We had guilds prop up again, but we had access to better technology and whatnot. But then we have the international style come about in the 1950s when the world is becoming a lot more integrated. They tried to develop a style that was more, I guess, universal. So they call it. I don't really agree with it. I think it's a little silly. And so do a lot of other people when you try to think of a system that works for everyone in the exact same way. It's a big criticism of this style. But we start to apply an international style of thinking to what our symbols mean when we're designing for things that'll be seen by many different cultures. These are examples of Olympic icons, throughout the Olympics. So that's my brief little introduction.
I don't know if you've seen like the Cream album cover or like the Led Zeppelin one that's kind of similar to that. I want to explore like that kind of stuff because I think it's really cool.
Yeah, and with stuff like that, explore like the religious context. What was again the political scene, like what was popular cinema at the time? You might start to understand why things looked a certain way at that time. You kind of do have to put on the hat of a historian to really delve in and answer some of these problems, but I think that's part of the fun of being a graphic designer. I mean, you can still apply this thinking now. For example, here's a little tidbit. You guys have seen the iOS, new iOS stuff, right? Well, back during like the iPhone 4, we had this big design term called skeuomorphism, where we basically tried to make things on our phones look like they do in real life. For example, like the phone icon or the recycling bin. And I do think it's really cool. I mean, there was this whole push for like, what is the objective truth of the world? And people were like putting photographs on stuff, but then computers were also being, rolled out publicly. And they're like, what if we altered these photos through computers? So you start to see this weird play on, framing things in boxes, altering pictures to be more saturated, give them an electric vibe and feel. And there's a lot of fun stuff that came out of that, I think.
Definitely. And have I missed anybody for the group